Okay, welcome. I'm Andrea Fiorillo, the head of research and reader services at the Reading Public Library. I want to thank the Friends of the Library for sponsoring tonight's program. We have a few upcoming events. We have a lot of upcoming events, but I have a few that I'm going to tell you about. Age Well, Be Well, a Better Sleep program is happening Thursday, February 10th at 7 p.m. I will put the registration for that up in the chat. And our annual Winter Warmer book talks are again recorded this year. Thank you, COVID. But they'll be released Monday, February 14th at 7 p.m. You don't have to register for that. We'll just put it up on our YouTube channel and link to that on our website. So it's going to be a Valentine's Day hot date edition this year. Tonight, Nia, you can come too, you're invited. Tonight, I want to start our discussion on climate justice with the acknowledgement that the Reading Public Library stands on the ancestral lands of the Pawtucket Band of the Massachusetts tribe. The Pawtucket called this area home for thousands of years before English colonists claimed it. For more information on the Massachusetts people, visit massachusettstribe.org. I'll put that up in the chat as well. I am delighted to welcome Nia Keith here tonight. We've been working on this for months and months. Ms. Keith formerly was the Climate Change Education Manager at Mass Audubon and is currently their Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Justice. She has more than 15 years experience working in nonprofit schools and cultural institutions. She earned her Master's of Science in Environmental Studies from Antioch University, New England. Please welcome Nia Keith.
Thank you so much for having me tonight. I'm so excited to be here. I know we were supposed to do this many months ago and I got sick, not COVID, but was sick and couldn't do it, but here we are. And so I'm going to share my screen and we'll jump into tonight's presentation because we have a lot to cover. I'll skip through this first slide or two. So I'm Nia Keith, as she said, I'm a social justice educator and consultant. I've been doing education for a long time, and environmental justice has always been at the heart of the work that I do. I have done a lot of work around food sovereignty and access to green spaces, and in recent years, climate justice as well. I also wanted to do an acknowledgement as we go forward to acknowledge that I am in my home, officing in my home, which is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Pennacook people. And like the Reading Library, I highly encourage people to find out more about the lands that they currently occupy and the contemporary and ancestral peoples who have and do live in this land. I think it's very important for us to recognize that Indigenous communities across the globe are at the front lines of climate change activism, land stewardship efforts, and conservation. And it's important that their voices and their work become centered in the environmental movement. And so I encourage everybody to take some time to learn about the Indigenous environmental movement and to do what we can to support and elevate their work. So we're going to be talking about some heavy topics tonight. We'll be talking about climate change. We'll be talking about environmental injustice. And this might bring up some feelings of frustration or sadness or even hopelessness for some people who are listening or watching tonight. These feelings are totally normal and should be acknowledged. But I also want to talk about the fact that research has shown that taking action on these things, on climate change, can actually reduce our anxiety and our depressions and our feelings of hopelessness. It can offer us hope, and that is an important piece of climate resilience. So I'm going to make a point to share at the end of this presentation ways that you can take action and fight what is happening to our climate. And trust me when I say that there are solutions. This is not hopeless. We just need to act decisively and we need to act now. So before we go too far into the presentation, I always kind of like to start at the very beginning to just make sure that when we're talking about climate change and its impacts, that we're all on the same page. So I have this definition that I helped create about climate change. And so I'd like everybody to just take a moment to consider this definition. Climate change is a rapid change in global climate patterns, which is threatening the sustainability of human and natural systems caused by human activities that release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The effects of climate change can be mitigated through large-scale actions and policies that support natural climate solutions, reduce or eliminate greenhouse gases, and address social and economic disparities. So besides the fact that this might be the longest definition of climate change that you've seen, I'd love for people to take a moment to put into the chat or unmic if they like to, unmute, and share, what do you notice about this definition that is different than other definitions of climate change that you may have seen? Again, people can use the chat if they want to, or they can use their mic. What stands out about this definition or in this definition?
Social and economic disparities are being addressed.
Yes, absolutely.
It's more solution oriented.
Exactly. So those are like two of the big pieces. Like, I really like to point out that talking about the fact that this is a rapid change, I feel like it is so important that when we talk about climate change, we talk about the fact that what is happening extremely fast. This is important because a lot of people, because climate change seems to be slow, there are people who still don't realize that climate change is already happening. It has been happening for decades, and they think this is something that's still far off into the future. So emphasizing that this is rapid and this is happening now. I also really like to emphasize the human part of the impacts, because we often talk about climate change as if it is an environmental problem, and it is, but it is actually caused by human activity. And there are impacts to humans as well as what's happening to the environment. Human systems are being degraded and destroyed, and humans who have been marginalized by society are being impacted the most by that. And as you pointed out, it's so important to talk about the solutions when we talk about climate change. Oftentimes people talk about climate change only in the fact of its impacts, and this can lead to people feeling hopeless and then separating themselves. So when we talk about climate change, it's so important to be solution oriented when we do. And so that is like, we haven't talked about action yet, but just one thing that you can do that is actually super important if you want to take climate action is that when you talk about climate change, talk about the human impacts, talk about the disparities, and talk about the solutions. And those solutions include addressing social and economic disparities. And we'll get more into what that means in just a little bit. So I do want to talk about impacts before we get into the social and economic piece. I do want to talk about some of these environmental impacts that we are already seeing and what has been, what people believe we will see if we don't do something immediately to start mitigating climate change impacts. So here in Massachusetts, where the temperature is actually rising faster than global averages, we're seeing a lot of distinct effects. You can see from this slide that sea level has already risen significantly since 1895, which seems like, oh, that's 100 years, but like, that's a lot of rise. Storms are growing stronger. There's more energy in the system, which means that we have stronger storms, bigger waves, more wind. Our growing season has actually extended by nearly 2 weeks, which means, yay, we can grow more food. But what that also means is that our seasons are actually going out of their natural balance and cycle. We have longer summers, which means shorter winters. What is this going to look like if we do not turn things around? Well, if left unchecked, we are going to see trends that are going to lead to disastrous results. And in fact, in 80 years, we could see an average temperature that is 11 degrees hotter than what we are experiencing today. And just in case you think 11 degrees shift is like no big deal, I want you to think about that during the last ice age, when there was a mile of ice that covered Massachusetts, the average global temperature was 9 degrees cooler than what we see today. So a 9 degrees cooler shift meant a mile of ice covering our our continent. If we don't reduce carbon emissions globally, we could be seeing that same magnitude of change, but in the warming direction in the lifetime of children that are alive today. And regionally, we are seeing some very important impacts already. We are seeing economic loss due to changing ecosystems, due to storm damage, and impacts to industry like recreation and tourism is all causing economic loss already in our region. Also, health risk due to heat waves and increased disease vectors and poor air quality. So we have cities like Springfield that have been named the asthma capital of the United States. And part of that is because of the poor air quality, which is exacerbated by warmer air, which we have more of now because of climate change. Also, ticks are vectors of disease for things like Lyme and other diseases, and contact with ticks is increasing rapidly as the temperature warms and stays warm. Longer summers means that the ticks can breathe longer. It also means people are outside trying to get away from the heat and have more contact. And so we're already seeing a rise in tick-borne illnesses due to the change in our climate as well. And then last but not least, of course, we have infrastructure damage that is leading to housing insecurity and forced migration. So these are impacts we are already seeing in our region, in our state, that are only going to get worse as the climate continues to change. But getting to the heart of today's conversation around climate justice, one of the things that is important to highlight is that although the impacts of climate change are being felt everywhere, not everyone experiences the impacts at the same proportion. Some communities are impacted more than others, and sadly, the communities that have historically been the most oppressed and marginalized are the same communities that are often experience the worst effects of environmental harm and degradation. And I want to emphasize that this did not happen by accident. This oppression has been achieved systematically through laws, policies, and social norms. This systemic oppression is designed to uphold a global capitalist economy that was built by and depends upon the extraction and exploitation of natural resources and people. And in this system, those who perform the hardest labor are rarely the ones allowed to keep the wealth. And meanwhile, the land around them may be stripped of its life-giving elements, leaving people deprived of the necessities and benefits of nature. And for the past 500 years, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color have suffered the most under this regime. Oops, sorry about that. So I want to go back to the beginning to kind of talk about, like, how did we get to this point where environmental injustice and climate change impacts are being felt by people of color more than other people. And, you know, there's a meme out there that says that environmental justice is nothing new. And this is very true. Environmental justice is actually baked into the beginnings of this nation. So from the very beginning, settler colonialism set up an economic system that was designed to exploit nature for the benefit of the very few. And so one of the things that we can see, or several of the things we've seen from the impacts of this exploitive colonization, is Indigenous people being removed from the land. And this is a really important piece of how we got to this state of environmental injustice, because Indigenous people lived as one with the land. And in fact, like in the Abenaki language, there's no word for nature because everything is interconnected. So other animals, plants, and elements of the land were seen as other peoples who had to be respected, and they maintained a balance which created a thriving and abundant ecosystem. But in the eyes of the colonial settlers, nature was commodified. It was seen as a commodity and a resource. And there was no acknowledgement that there should be limits to how much could be taken from the land. So when a resource was used up in one place, they moved to another place and started the process all over again. And this kind of extractive economy could not be achieved without a large labor force, i.e. slavery. So the slavery being made legal and baked into our legal system here in the United States was done intentionally in order to support an extractive economy that was designed to take from the land as rapidly as possible in order to create wealth. And in order to be able to uphold a system of slavery, we had to create a legal system that divided people and said that some people could be treated a certain way while others could not. And so we created a legal system that defined race and racism. So we created a system that was designed to oppress people based on perceived external appearance and said that you can do what you want to this group of people. And so from the very beginning, you can see that under this extractive economy, people and land that were considered property, there was a desire, or not desire, there was a belief that you could do whatever you want to your property. So this quote actually comes from the movie 12 Years a Slave. And the person in the movie was actually depicting a real life slave owner. And this was a quote, "A man is free to do as he pleases with his property." And that property meant people and land. And so what we have created is a system where people could take what they wanted and leave behind areas that have been deprived of their natural structures and force the people who are considered the least valuable in society to live in these degraded spaces. And so come forward hundreds of years of this practice, and what we now have are areas of our country, of our world actually, but areas of our country and even within our own state that have become sacrifice zones. So sacrifice zones are communities that are adjacent to heavily polluted or environmentally degraded areas. And these are areas where waste and pollution that are created by our consumptive economy end up. And most often these disinvested low-income communities are communities of color and communities of people with low income. And these people and places are being sacrificed without their permission so that others can live without the environmental burden of the extractive economy. Another byproduct of this extractive economy is the creation of frontline and fence line communities. So frontline communities are communities that exist, that experience the first and the worst consequences of climate change. These neighborhoods often lack basic infrastructure to support them and will be increasingly vulnerable as the climate deteriorates. A fence line community is a neighborhood that is immediately adjacent to a polluting company and is directly affected by the noise, odors, chemical emissions, traffic, parking, and daily operation. The effects of being exposed to such pollutants are exacerbated by climate change, which is impacting the health and the economy of the nearby residents. And again, very frequently, these are communities of color and communities that are low income. So now that we've had an opportunity to look at how we got here, I want to talk about identities and who are the most vulnerable populations to climate change. So as I said, people of color often are in the most vulnerable climate vulnerable spaces, climate justice communities, but other populations are more likely to be impacted by climate change than others as well. For example, women and transgender people, people with disabilities, youth and children, and the elderly are all more likely to have disproportionate impacts of climate change than others. So right now you might be thinking, wait, just because I'm a woman doesn't mean that I'm more vulnerable to climate change. And of course, it's not that simple. You know, our identities are multifaceted and incorporate everything from our age and our education to our race and our gender expression. So the unique combination of these facets influence every part of our lives, from where we're likely to live to how likely we are to have access to clean water or healthcare. And so to kind of understand this better, I wanted to bring in this term, intersectionality. It was coined by lawyer and civil rights activist Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989 to describe the way that overlapping identities create particular experiences of oppression. So according to the Webster Dictionary, intersectionality is the complex cumulative way in which the effects of multiple forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, and classism, combine, overlap, or intersect, especially in the experience of marginalized individuals or groups. So the difficulties faced by a woman are going to be different than the difficulties faced by a woman with a disability, for example. So when I talk about these vulnerable communities, it doesn't simply mean that just because you have one identity aspect, that automatically means that you're going to be impacted the most by climate change. However, when we look at the intersection of multiple identities that have been oppressed by society, you start to see that there is a correlation between how likely a person is to be impacted by climate change is connected to these intersectional identities. So now I want to take a moment to look a little bit more closely at how different identities are being impacted by climate change. So let's start by looking at how race can impact how a person is experiencing climate change. So through practices such as redlining and other forms of systemic oppression, people of color often live in communities that bear the brunt of environmental harm. So this comes in many forms, from the fence line communities that I mentioned before, which are adjacent to factories and power plants, waste processors, to overly developed urban centers that have been stripped of their tree canopies and green spaces. These are things that the environment would normally have that would blunt the impacts of warming, but in a lot of urban spaces that have been disinvested, those things don't exist. So the intersectionality of race means that people of color are also less likely to have access to healthcare if they become sick from environmental exposures. And they are more likely to have occupations that bring them into closer contact with these conditions as well, and are often marginalized from having the political and economic power to change the system. So you think about situations where people have tried to suppress the vote of Black people, of Latinx people. So all of these aspects overlap to mean that a person of color is more likely to live in a neighborhood that is being impacted by environmental degradation and is going to experience then climate change risk at a greater rate than other communities. And as I had said before, like, environmental injustice is nothing new. And here in Massachusetts, we are seeing impacts of that already. So this chart here, you can see just two things that to look at. You can see that there are 24 times as many hazardous waste sites and 10 times the amount of chemical pollution released into the air of communities of color than their counterpart white communities. And in communities of color, an average of 48 hazardous waste sites exist per square mile, and 200,000 pounds of chemical pollution are released into the environment annually, compared to just 2 hazardous waste sites per square mile and about 19,000 pounds of chemical pollution that is released into white communities. So this is a big problem. Let's take a look at gender. How does gender play a role in this? Well, in the United States and actually globally, women are much more likely to be the victims of poverty than men. So this means that they are more likely to live in communities with fewer resources and older infrastructure. They are less likely to have access to healthcare. And all of this means that in the event of a climate disaster, women are more likely to die. And in fact, statistically speaking, women are 14 times more likely to die during a climate disaster than a man. And gender affects people's survival in other ways too. Women are more likely to experience violence during displacement or emergency situations. And transgendered and gender nonconforming people are 7 times more likely to experience violence at the hands of law enforcement. So this heightened threat of violence seriously undermines a person's ability to survive a climate disaster, especially when the very people who are supposed to be helping might be the perpetrators of the violence. Ability. So differences in cognitive ability, physical ability, and experienced trauma can all impact a person's ability to avoid, adapt, and recover from climate change impacts. A person who is physically disabled may find it difficult to evacuate an area or locate a shelter that can accommodate their physical needs, leaving them vulnerable to the impacts. A person with cognitive disabilities may not be able to sufficiently plan for a climate emergency or may have difficulties responding to the event in a timely manner, which reduces their chances of survival. And a person who has experienced trauma or is suffering from mental illness may not have the coping mechanisms to make appropriate decisions in the face of a crisis, all of which means that the impacts could be more severe and even life-threatening. When it comes to age, there are increased risks on either end of the spectrum. Both the very young and the old and the elderly are more likely to experience impacts from climate change. So let's take a look at why children are more vulnerable. Well, children are more vulnerable in part because environmental pollutants can more easily impact their smaller bodies. Their bodies haven't formed completely yet. And so not only can they become sick quicker, but they can actually be impacted their development so that they can have ongoing problems for the rest of their lives. For older people, they may suffer from climate change impacts for a couple of different reasons. Many older people have deteriorating immune systems, which can lead to serious illness. They may lack mobility or have mental impairments, which have made them disabled. And additionally, that many elderly people suffer from social isolation. So during a climate disaster, these people may not have the networks or the support that they need to allow them to avoid the worst of the impacts. And the last piece of this identity puzzle that I want to look at is class. So low-income communities, many of which are also communities of color, are the most vulnerable to climate change impacts. Due to generations of disinvestment, these communities often have impaired infrastructure, leading to increased flooding, property damage, and displacement. And oftentimes there is an insufficient amount of green space, causing a heat island effect, where residents experience temperatures several degrees hotter than their suburban and rural counterparts. And low-income communities are often crowded with civil departments that are too small and under-resourced. So during a climate disaster, these residents may not be able to evacuate or find the help they need from emergency responders. And before you begin to write off environmental racism as just a problem of income, I want you to think about the work from researcher Carrie Ard. She's a researcher at The Ohio State University, and she has found that African Americans who are living above the poverty line, are still exposed to more toxins than white Americans who are living in poverty. And this is despite the fact that Black Americans exhibit higher levels of organizational activism and political participation than their white community counterparts. So it is not just a matter of class and income. Again, that intersectionality is super important in really understanding why some people are more vulnerable than others. And a classic example of this vulnerability and this impact has played out twice now in the last decade or so in New Orleans. We've seen how low-income communities often lack the ability to rebuild after a disaster, and these communities continue to be disinvested and under-resourced, and the government doesn't provide enough money or resources to rebuild, and individual property owners may not have the money or the insurance to rebuild after it. And so this image here is an image from New Orleans' lower 9th Ward, which was devastated by Hurricane Katrina 17 years ago, and it still has not recovered. So in summary, the roots of environmental exploitation are intertwined with the roots of human exploitation, and we cannot solve one without the other. Traditionally, the environmental movement has often ignored or sidelined the needs of those with marginalized identities. However, we cannot solve climate change or any other environmental issue without addressing the underlying social injustices of the system that brought us to this point. And so that is why I always say that there is no climate action without climate justice. So before we go into talking about how we find some solutions, I want to pause and open up for questions, comments, what's bubbling up for people, what's coming to mind. And again, feel free to use the chat or to unmute and use your mic.
Does Audubon have any plans for getting teens maybe using a work camp idea in the summer to change a vacant lot into a garden? Something that would make a empty pile of rubbish space be green and growing and producing food?
Yeah, so actually what we do have already is what we call our Youth Climate Leadership Program. We've been running the YCLP for short for about 5 years, I believe, and we have 6 different teams around the state. And what the Youth Climate Leadership Program is it's a year-long program where teens, mostly in high school, but some in middle school, come together and they do environmental education, climate justice education for their peers, and they also do local projects. So the teams actually decide on their own climate justice solutions, their own projects, and they produce that with help from adult mentors at Mass Audubon every year. So some of them have taken on growing food in community garden spaces. Others have taken on the issues of overconsumption of plastics. Some have taken on education for adults. They've gone and they have campaigned for getting climate education into the school systems. So they actually, the youth do a number of really amazing local and statewide projects to bring about some mitigation for climate change. So great question. And if you're interested in learning more about the Youth Climate Leadership Program, you can contact me via email and I can put you in contact with someone and in case you know local youth who would benefit from being part of the program.
I was just thinking that it would be really beneficial for suburban youth to be involved with that.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, we try to have chapters anywhere that there is interest. So we have them in suburban spaces. We also have them in like the Boston Nature Center, which is in Mattapan. So please, yeah, contact me through email and I'm happy to share that resource. If you know of a local group that would like to form a leadership team, it'd be amazing. Any other questions or comments or even just feelings that are bubbling up for people? I just gave you a ton of information. I know it's like drinking through a fire hose, so it's a lot to take in, but any other thoughts? All right. So if there's nothing in the chat and no one wants to unmute, I'm going to move on to the second half of the presentation and talk about equitable solutions. But please, at any time, you can put some things into the chat and we'll have some time at the end to come back to any questions that do come up. So let's talk about how we as concerned community members can contribute to battling climate change and its impacts. So I want to start this part off by emphasizing the importance of drawdown. Ultimately, no matter what action we decide to take, the goal is the same. We need to get to a state of drawdown. And so what is drawdown? Well, according to Project Drawdown, which is a leading source in climate change solution, drawdown is the future point in time when levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere stop climbing and start to steadily decline. This is the point when we begin the process of stopping further climate change and averting potentially catastrophic warming. It is a critical turning point for life on Earth. So there are 3 major categories of things that we need to do in order to get to a state of drawdown. 1, we need to protect and support nature so that plants, soils, and oceans can pull down the excess carbon that is already in the atmosphere. 2, we need to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions or drastically reduce them. So the nature is fabulous because it already has like organic systems that will pull carbon from the sky, but that's not going to mean anything if we don't stop making as much as we are. So we need to eliminate greenhouse gas emissions or drastically reduce them when complete elimination is not possible. And then the third thing is that we need to create a just and equitable society. Remember, our extractive and exploitative economy is at the heart of this crisis. So if we don't address the social inequity, we'll never be able to make significant and lasting change. So to change the system, everyone needs to have an equal seat at the table. So we must protect the rights for people to participate in the democratic process. We have to ensure equal access to education, healthcare, and employment. And we need to distribute the benefits of nature to everyone in every neighborhood. This is what it means to create a just and equitable society when we're thinking about combating climate change. I also think it's really important that as we think about taking climate action from a lens of equity and justice, it's important to understand that everyone's idea of what constitutes a climate issue might not always look the same. We have to broaden our perspective for what constitutes an environmental or a climate issue. Traditional environmental issues are usually framed as protecting nature or habitats, but in communities that are suffering from like increased levels of asthma per se, this might not be as high a priority as doing something to take care of what is polluting the air in that city or that town. And that is also an environmental issue. So for climate vulnerable communities, ecological concerns often intersect with social, economic, and political concerns, producing campaigns that address issues like access to green space, land and water rights, food security, having inclusion in the green economy, clean transportation, and protection of voting rights. So a lot of times when people think about how do we act to address climate justice, they might not think about things like becoming part of a campaign that is protecting voter rights. People might not see that as being a direct connection, but making sure that everybody has access to the political process is one of the most important things we can do to bring about justice. And you'll actually see that as a major cornerstone of a lot of environmental and climate campaigns that are being launched by people of color and youth, is this idea of protecting people's ability to participate in our democratic process. So thinking outside the box about what constitutes an environmental issue is super important as we go forward in this work. It's also important that we understand that climate activism can fall along a spectrum, ranging from immediate individual action to more committed collective engagement. Ultimately, we need collective engagement in order to create the systemic change that will mitigate climate change. However, every person's journey is different and there are lots of ways to get involved. So it can be helpful to think of climate action with 3 different levels of engagement. And you can kind of listen to these levels and figure out where you feel like you're comfortable at. Start with some of the suggestions, and then the idea is that as you move in your climate journey, you can move up in the levels and get deeper and more involved. So at level 1, we're looking at climate actions that include things like educating yourself and others. So congratulations, if you're here tonight, you are already taking climate action because you are engaging in education about what this means and what you could do to help. That's so critically important. But also posting on social media outlets about climate change to spread awareness is important. Talking with friends, family, and your community about climate change, and doing things like eating a plant-rich diet are all ways that we can contribute individually. And sometimes it might seem like talking to someone about climate change really isn't that significant, but research has shown that even though the majority of people in the United States believe climate change is real and that it is something that we need to address in the near and immediate future, that very few people actually talk about climate change to their networks or their communities. So we cannot solve a problem that we aren't talking about. So even though talking about it might seem insignificant, it's actually so important that we start to engage everyone we know in this conversation so that we can start working together collectively to find solutions. So when we think about our networks, also expanding our networks are really important. Reach out to groups that are working on parallel issues. Again, when we think about justice, you might be finding partnerships in this climate journey in places that are unexpected. So looking at organizations or grassroots movements that are addressing things like food security, public health, and access to green spaces are all really good connections to have in your network as you're doing this work. You might meet people who move in different circles and have different ideas and strengths. And if you get to talking, you'll probably discover that they have a climate agenda that supports yours as well. At level 2's level of engagement, we start to look at action that is more collective and more community-based. So these actions include joining a group that is organizing and advocating around climate change, hosting a community-based event like a climate cafe, lobbying your representatives, or organizing your neighborhood to collectively purchase renewable energy or create composting. All of these things are part of our climate solutions. And this is when you're ready to step up and do something more collective. This is great work to take on. So getting involved locally, what are some ways that you can do that? Well, a lot of people don't realize that decisions involving infrastructure to energy options are often made at the local level. It's so important to find out what your town's decisions are around things like land use, and also like waste disposal and energy. These are decisions that get made by your municipality, and you have the right to learn about those, to have your opinions heard at town meetings, and obviously to vote for the support or not support to make decisions that are going to be best for our climate. So supporting your town's local climate initiatives are really important. And I want to talk a little bit about a program that Massachusetts has called the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, the MVP. The MVP is a program, a grant program that provides supports for cities and towns in Massachusetts to begin the process of planning for climate change, resiliency, and it also gives money for implementing priority projects. So the state awards communities with funding to complete vulnerability assessments and to develop action-oriented resiliency plans. And so when the communities complete the MVP program, they become certified as an MVP community and are eligible for MVP action grant funding and opportunities. So I highly suggest that you go to the mass.gov website and look up the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program. Find out if your town already has a plan, and if it does, see if you can support some of the action items in that plan. And if your town doesn't have an MVP plan, you can work with somebody in your town to apply for a grant. In fact, I believe the new grant cycle is about to open up soon. Your town could apply for money to help do a climate assessment and to come up with an action plan that could change your neighborhood. At level 3 climate action, we are getting into some spaces where some people might feel less comfortable, but at the same time, these are the kinds of actions that often raise large amounts of awareness for people and really start to move the needle societally about people's interest in doing climate work. So this kind of level 3 action includes organizing a protest or a rally, participating in a mass strike, collective boycotting, and also disinvesting from polluting companies and institutions. One of the things that I did personally as part of this disinvestment is I actually found out what companies were being supported by my retirement fund, and I disinvested all of my retirement money from fossil fuel companies, so that the money that is going into my retirement accounts is no longer going into the banks that are supporting these companies. So things like that can be done at the individual level that can also impact at a bigger level too. When it comes to supporting grassroots organizations, it's really great to be able to provide financial aid to the people who are out there doing some of this grassroots work. It might seem super simplistic, but these grassroots organizations very much need volunteer time and they need financial support. So that's a really wonderful way that you can support grassroots movements going forward. And these organizations that I've listed here are some of my favorites who are doing impactful work for the environment. So I highly suggest that you look them up or find one in your own neighborhood that you would like to support. Also, youth voices matter. As we were discussing earlier, Mass Audubon is very invested in supporting youth who are on the front lines of doing this climate work. Youth are a marginalized group, if only because they are going to absolutely be getting the worst of the impacts in the future. And at this point, being young, they don't even have access to the democratic process. So we need to support their movement and support their voices. We need to listen to what they're saying, and we need to help them get their work done. So supporting youth voices is extraordinarily important. So as I come into the close of this presentation, I want to come back again to hope. Getting to drawdown is going to take time and determination. Therefore, we all need something to help us remain hopeful and to keep us engaged in this fight. So maybe you're doing it for the animals that, whose habitat is threatened, or maybe you're doing it to protect the coastal town where you grew up, or maybe you're doing it for the next generation who will inherit this planet. But I just want you to remember that no matter what your reasons, hope is a form of climate resilience. So stay engaged and don't give up. So I am now going to stop sharing and open up for any other questions or thoughts that people might have.
Yeah, it's Andrea. I just wanted to say that Dina put up something into the chat about Reddings MVP Plan. And for some reason, I'm unable to cut it. It's like a direct chat to me. I'm unable to cut and paste it into the chat for everyone, but I'm going to keep, sorry, I have my mask on. I'm going to keep trying.
It won't go into the chat.
Did you hear me?
Yeah, I think I just pasted it in there for you. The Redding MVP plan.
Yeah, I'm trying to get it up in the chat. I missed some of what you said, but.
Oh no, I think I just put it in the chat for you.
You put it up. Perfect. Thank you.
Yes, there we go. Yeah, so please, thank you for putting that up there. People should definitely look at the Redding MVP plan, and it's actually the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program is a really amazing program. I think it's the only one in the country like this, where individual municipalities can actually get grant money from the state to do this kind of work. So, I mean, it gives me hope every time I look at what Massachusetts is doing, because we're not doing it perfect, but we are making some really wonderful strides in climate work that I'm hoping will become a blueprint for other states as well. Did anyone?
We have a big community of birders in Reading. Do you have any special, since you're coming from the Audubon, do you have any special recommendations for ways that birders can get involved?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. So I will say there's actually a number of opportunities for protection of habitat. That is a huge thing, because especially in Massachusetts, you kind of get a double win, because protecting habitat here, we actually have a number of birds that are vulnerable that fly from other parts of the world and then like nest here seasonally. So protecting nature here in Massachusetts is really important, because it's protecting kind of like both ends of those birds' habitats, right? So there are programs that you can get involved with that are looking at land protection here in the state, especially along the coast, where we have a lot of coastal birds that are in jeopardy. We have like a coastal water birds program at Mass Audubon that you can get involved with, that does research, but also does education around how to protect that land. We also have a number of coastal resiliency efforts that are going on right now to help people think about different ways that municipalities can support like wetlands and decrease flooding, because of course, as the sea level rises and the waves rise, these vulnerable bird populations are, going to be even more threatened. So supporting those coastal resiliency programs, supporting habitat protection programs, here in Massachusetts and looking at programs that are operating in other countries like Belize, where we have these migrations, and supporting the other end of their migration is really important too, because they need both halves.
I'm going to give people a chance to unmute themselves and turn their cameras on or enter something into the chat. But as I do that, I do have another question. You know, I like to contribute to organizations and be a member of organizations like Audubon that have that buy up land, set aside land to help our ecosystem do what it's meant to do. But definitely most of those properties, I won't speak to the Audubon as much, but like I think of the trustees of reservations, they tend to be in well-heeled communities. They tend to be in the communities that already have a lot of resources, like Reading already has a lot of town forests set aside for people who already have their own private green space as well. And so I love to put my resources into preserving ecosystems, but how do we give back ecosystems to communities that have been taken away from? Like, do you have any recommendations there?
Yes, I'm so glad that you brought that up. So first of all, I'm going to drop into the chat a link to Mass Audubon's action agenda. We just adopted this action agenda last year, and it addresses 3 major things: land protection, access to equitable access to nature, and climate change. And of course, all these things are also interwoven, but specifically when we're thinking about equitable access to nature, what we are looking at is actually how do we restore areas that have been deprived of their green space? How do we get areas, communities that do not have access to green or blue space? We also think about water access, more access, not only because the benefits of nature have been proven to heal people, but we know from a climate standpoint that like we need the tree canopy, we need the, you know, the water to be able to be absorbed into the ground, we need the shade. So
the birds need someplace to land.
The birds need someplace to land, exactly. So all these things. So we actually have a goal that over the next 5 years, we are going to establish 3 new urban sanctuaries that will be places like our Boston Nature Center, if people have ever been there before, that are going to be like growing more green space and providing habitat for animals and also shelter and access for people. And in addition, we are going to be partnering with municipalities and agencies and other organizations to increase access in 20 urban neighborhoods around the Commonwealth, where we're going to be providing programming for people to get people out into nature, but also looking at ways that we can restore the habitats that have been harmed. So that's everything from restoring some rivers and removing culverts to planting trees. So we are definitely looking at increasing green space as a major component of our work over the next 5 years. And other organizations are looking at it as well. So I would say if that's where your heart lies, first of all, awesome. I'm a huge believer, but you look at what organizations are doing now to address disparities in urban centers, because no longer are people thinking that it's okay to just do this kind of work in communities that are already wealthy with green space. We know that if we are going to save any of us, we have to save all of us.
Well said. All right, any other questions?
I just wanted to point out that the Ipswich River Watershed is doing a lot of coastal resilience work along the Massachusetts coast, and that's our watershed in Reading. It's one of the 3 watersheds that we have in Reading, and they do great work. And I think they probably help with the birds by doing some of the stuff they're doing.
Yep.
I just wanted to ask, in terms of education, if there are any books that are really great for beginners that want to learn more and want to read more?
So that's a great question. And I wish I could point to a book right away. I typically personally don't go to books very often when it comes to climate, only because the movement is happening so rapidly that print publishing usually can't keep up. So I would be happy though to give you several different amazing websites that you could get some fantastic information from, like Drawdown, which was one of them that I mentioned earlier. Project Drawdown is an amazing site, and they actually do have a book that is, I think, one of the best out there, because it talks about solutions, and the way that Project Drawdown arranges their solutions, I think, is like the best. They give you all these categories that you could go to if you're interested in doing something with land. They have a whole section. It's like, you want to work with land? Here's 17 different ways that you can help make an impact with land. You're interested in food? Here's 7 different ways you could do that. So I highly suggest going to either reading Drawdown's book or going to Drawdown's website.
Okay, and because I'm a librarian, I have to jump in with a few books, and they're not like the latest books on climate justice, but Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer.
So good.
It's really good, and I think also it really helps reframe the way that like colonial capitalism thinks about the earth and animals and plants, and gives us like indigenous viewpoint of how to live side by side with the natural world, and to complement the natural world instead of always taking from it. You know, that it's more of a reciprocal relationship. It's really good, and it's been a big bestseller. And then I also would recommend people go back to Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which doesn't talk as much about the justice issue, but it talks about how maybe we kind of gave up some of our oversight over having a healthy environment for all in the name of profit. And she's a beautiful writer, just as Robin Wall Kimmerer is. And so I highly recommend that.
Yes,
Put
Kimmerer's
that
book.
up in the chat.
Yeah, Kimmerer's book is amazing. I love it. Everybody should read that book. Another one that I think is not climate related specifically, but if you liked Kimmerer's book, and it talks about race and history and land, and that is the book Trace by Laurette Savoy, and I put that in the chat. And she's an African-American woman, and she talks about like her journey, her connection to land, her family's connection to land, also really good. So if these are like, all these books are excellent in that they don't necessarily speak directly to climate, but they do speak directly to that underlying issues of inequity and experience that has led us to this point. So thank you, Andrea, for pointing that out.
And we also have a question in the chat from Willie. It says, it seems clear from Mrs. Keith's excellent presentation that climate justice is an important form of social justice. That said, though I hear some voices making this connection, it doesn't seem to be trumpeted enough. Do you find that organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center or the Equal Justice Initiative are giving climate enough attention?
No, so they're not giving it enough attention. I'm so glad you brought that up. I'm going to put another link in the chat. So I'm sure everybody here has heard of the movement for Black Lives or Black Lives Matter. There is a arm of the movement for Black Lives that is pushing forward a climate agenda. It is the Red, Black, and Green New Deal. And I bring this up because the fight to get climate represented as part of Black sovereignty and liberation was actually an internal struggle. It took climate activists inside the movement to say, do you realize that climate change and climate justice is a Black issue? And so it took about 1.5 years of this constant dialogue and championing from climate activists in the movement to get the movement for Black lives to realize that this is a Black issue that they had to speak up about. So no, I do not think right now, some of the people doing the most amazing social justice work are not making the connections right now that climate justice is a social justice issue. And we, in organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Foundation and others, need to be stepping up. So I am one of the members of the Black Hive, which is the kind of governing body of the Red, Black, and Green New Deal, and is moving forward that climate work. So I'm going to put that in the chat because I think it is so important that people become aware of the Black and Indigenous climate agendas that are out there, and putting that forward and saying hey, we all need this. We all should be talking about this. So there is a link to the Red, Black, and Green New Deal. It's also amazing reading the Red, Black, and Green New Deal and looking at the components of what they're saying is important for us to get climate justice. They include things like water and energy and land, but also things like labor and economy and democracy are all considered components of doing this work. So I highly suggest people go there and check them out.
I also wanted to say, Nia, and to Willie, that often the discussions about people of color and health outcomes and life expectancy outcomes are a little bit divorced from our discussions about pollution and green space and all of these environmental issues. And that, I think, does a disservice because it's all of a piece.
It is. Yeah, it's all connected. And I mean, that's one of the things that I am I'm proud of Mass Audubon for many things, but one of the things I'm really proud of what Mass Audubon is doing with their climate work and their land work right now is trying to make those connections publicly more frequently, is to point out to people that access to nature is a climate issue. It's a social justice issue. It's it's a human rights issue. And we need to make sure that everybody has this access. Like I said earlier, in order to save any of us, we have to save all of us. And starting to make those connections to health and the environment more overtly is so critical. No problem, Willie. Thanks for coming.
I don't see any new questions. There are some thank yous, though. A lot of thank yous and a lot of people saying you've done this well. Yeah, praise coming in.
Yay! Well, thank you so much for having me tonight. This has been wonderful. I never tire of talking about climate justice. So I love to chat with people more. We can get down into some of these specific movements that people are doing. So anything that we can do to help.
I just have one more thing. I was trying to make my spacebar work and it didn't, but I just read down east about 5 girls from Washington County, Maine, which is the poorest county in the country, and how they grew up and what happened to them and why they keep going back. But it pulled me towards some other things, and I found out that a women's health collaborative in Millbridge, Maine, which is a place where there's nothing going on, developed a 4.5 acre green space along the river and planted gardens, and the whole city is now invited to share that space and eat organic vegetables. And it's just a great example of how a small group of women concerned about health pulled together and did something that really serves the economically deprived.
I love it. What an amazing example. Thank you so much for sharing it.
Well, Senator Craig Hickman, a state senator from Maine, led the right to food law that was just passed this past legislative session in Maine.
And the thing is that so often people don't think about food sovereignty as being connected to climate justice, but it absolutely is. And it's also the idea of food sovereignty and access to land to grow food is a really pivotal piece of the Black liberation movement as well. So all of these things, again, like are intersectional and intertwining. So I highly suggest people, if you're interested in food sovereignty and land, looking at the Red, Black, and Green New Deal and looking at how they connect climate to those issues is really great. Jordan.
Hi, thank you. I just wanted to say thank you very much for the presentation and talk that you've given. I found it to be very, very informative, but I really also like the aspect of positivity, the fact that we could influence change in the right direction. Typically, these type of conversations end up in doom and gloom spiral, and so I just want to extend my appreciation for making it a little bit more optimistic than what I'm typically accustomed to hearing. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that feedback. And, it's very deliberate. I truly believe that hope is a form of resiliency, of climate resiliency. And if we get depressed, then we're not going to get through this, but we can. We already know what we need to do. Like, that's the thing. It's like, we already know what we need to do. We just need to all commit to doing it. Any other thoughts that people have, or questions or recommendations? I love when people share their recommendations. It's so glorious to see all the amazing stuff people are reading and being inspired by. Okay. Seems like people might be good for the night.
All right, thank you so much, Nia. Really appreciate it. And I like that you had such an engaged audience who's ready to go out and do the work, and sounds like they're already doing the work. So thank you to all of you for showing up and for being thoughtful guests. Take care and stay well out there.
Thank you, everyone.